So this is joint work with Ian Ayres and Scott Hemphill. You know, we're all economists who teach at law schools, so you know, we're trying to kind of situate this hopefully in the sweet spot where it can be appealing to everyone, right? So the idea here is, you know, this paper is shorting your rival negative ownership as an antitrust remedy. I guess before I start, I should say I would really, you know, shout out to Nick and everyone at the Antitrust Law Journal for very helpful revision process on this. So the basic idea here is, you know, you can think of by thinking about the JetBlue Spirit merger, and if I had known that we had the person who litigated it here, maybe I would have picked a different example, because I'm sure that, you know, we don't know nearly as much about it as he does. But the idea is, you know, as all of you know, in typical merger review, we have to think about balancing the anti-competitive effects with the efficiency gains. And kind of the standard process is that the agencies will approve a merger if they believe the efficiency benefits to consumers outweigh any anti-competitive effects. And, you know, more commonly, they may approve it with divestitures if they think that selling some assets to third parties will assure that the efficiency benefits outweigh the sort of now reduced anti-competitive effects. And of course, if none of that is possible, then they recommend blocking the deal. All right. So, you know, we'll go over this quickly since all of you are familiar with it, but right, we can have both, you know, unilateral anti-competitive effects, right? The JetBlue and Spirit may be priced higher because now there's no loss from consumers who switch from JetBlue to, you know, because of Spirit's higher prices, right? And again, this is going to matter most when JetBlue and Spirit are each other's closest competitors. But of course, there are other airlines that consumers can switch to as well. I'm not speaking enough into the mic, and so I lost my slides. All right, so, well, they're still up there. All right, anyway, there's also coordinated effects, right? So, you know, possibility of one less rival to disrupt any industry-wide collusion, and right, with fewer firms, it's easier to sustain that collusion. So again, we'll go over this quickly, right? And then we have possible pro-competitive effects, right? Economies of scale or scope, you know, more flights, more routes, potentially better responses to delays or cancellations and things of that nature. Right. So the problem in typical merger review is, right, is there a divestiture that can work, right? And, you know, we want to figure out sort of what assets can we divest, right? To whom can we divest those? And so, right, there was the proposal of JetBlue divesting Spirit's LaGuardia assets to Frontier. And there's questions sort of on both sides, right? So one, is that going to be enough to replace any lost competition, right? But on the other side, the question is, right, you know, the point of the merger is combining assets creates some efficiencies, and do these divestitures eliminate some of those efficiencies, right? And so, you know, we kind of worry about this balance between trying to reduce anti-competitive effects without getting rid of the efficiencies. And so, you know, obviously sometimes that works fine. There's divestitures which, you know, have a greater effect on the anti-competitive effects than on efficiencies. But sometimes it isn't the case, right? Sometimes it's hard to find divestitures that don't undermine the efficiencies kind of as much as they reduce the anti-competitive effects. And so our paper kind of goes at this to say, well, is there another alternative, right? Is there a way that we can obtain the potential efficiency benefits without reducing the incentives to compete? And our idea is basically negative ownership, right? And so, again, as I said, the idea is to obtain efficiency benefits without anti-competitive effects. And the way this works is that you basically take what's equivalent to a short position in your remaining rivals, right? So the merger weakens the incentive to compete with the firm that you bought, but if you have this negative ownership position where your profits will increase as the profits of your remaining rivals go down, that strengthens the incentives to compete with the other rivals, and the idea is to find a balance between this. As we note in the paper, sort of Ayers and Ross kind of first suggested this idea back in 1998. And the point is to kind of, again, create this more aggressive incentive to compete to balance with the less incentive to compete as a result of the merger. Right? And again, the idea is because we're not actually affecting asset ownership, right, this shouldn't have any effect on the efficiency benefits of the merger. So how does it work? All right. So again, what we want is profits or managerial payoffs to decrease with the profits of the remaining rivals. Right. So there's many ways this can happen. Right. Sort of the initial idea was you to actually take a direct short position in your remaining rivals. But it could also happen through executive compensation, right? So the merger could, part of approving the merger could be requiring stronger relative performance evaluation contracts for the executives who are making the competitive decisions, right? So their specific, pay package, in addition to potentially increasing with the stock price of their own firm, might be decreasing in the stock price of their rivals. So a simple example that we talk about in the paper, first we kind of start with symmetry because that's the easiest to understand. Imagine we had 6 symmetric airlines, right? And so if, say, Spirit and JetBlue and Delta, United, American, and Southwest, right? So Spirit's profit function is going to be a function of its own price, right? And that's going to be increasing up to a point and then decreasing. But it's also going to be increasing in the prices of all of its other competitors, right? And so what differs with the merger, right? Well, now the merged firm is considering this combined profit function of both Spirit and JetBlue. And it's going to give a direct incentive to increase price because now JetBlue's profits, as we said, is going to be increasing in the price of Spirit. And so since Spirit's now considering that, they have an incentive to increase their price a little bit. All right. So what happens with negative ownership? Well, we still have the same merged firm profit function, but now in the symmetric case, right, we can simply just require a 1/4 short position in each of the remaining rivals. And this is why it's simple with symmetry, right? If all of these are symmetric, that's going to basically become equivalent to the original profit function that each of the merged firm had, right? There's an incentive to increase the price of Spirit to raise the profits of JetBlue, but an incentive to decrease the price of Spirit flights to decrease profits for American, Delta, et cetera, because now the Spirit JetBlue firm has a negative ownership position in those other rivals. All right, and the idea is that's going to create identical pricing incentives as we had pre-merger, right? And if there's efficiencies, then the fact that those efficiencies exist will tend to lead to lower prices. Now, we work through in the paper, and I won't go through the details, but you can also do this with asymmetry, so it's sort of closer to Spirit JetBlue. We have 2 small airlines, 4 big airlines. We assume that the reason the big airlines are bigger is they provide slightly higher value in some way or another to consumers. And again, I'll go through this quickly, but we have sort of a simple, generalization of hoteling competition, and you can work through the math to kind of figure out what's the pre-merger prices in this for both the low value airlines and the high value airlines, and then we can see what happens post-merger, and you can go through and you put in some efficiency term, and you see, well, what's going to happen with the merging prices with some efficiency without any negative ownership remedy. And what we see here is, unless these efficiencies are quite large, that prices are going to go up, right? And we just have a simple example. If the difference in value is sort of half the transportation costs and the efficiencies are 16th of the transportation costs, then what we end up with is about 10% increase in margins for the merged firms and 2% increase for others. And again, this is just sort of to be illustrative. Now, what happens when we put in a short position, right? So now we're going to say we're going to say a short position of some size Z in the remaining rivals. And so now our merged firm is going to maximize the profits from their own direct profits and the profits from this short position, and that's again the second line there. And so we have these new effects, right? Now they want, again, to increase their prices to increase the profits from the first line, the combined profits of JetBlue and Spirit, but they have now downward pricing pressure because they want to decrease the prices of the remaining rivals from the negative ownership position. And in general, there's always going to be a Z that will sort of exactly balance out these two effects and sort of recreate the same pricing incentives that we had pre-merger, right? And so again, in this simple example, you can work through this and get expressions for what the prices are with some short position. And again, what we can see, and we work through in the paper, is that the prices are decreasing in the size of the short position. And when the merged firms are somewhat smaller and efficiencies are larger, that's going to imply a smaller necessary short position in order to get prices back to where they would be pre-merger, right? And again, we can sort of go through with the same parameters and see that a short of 13% in the remaining four rivals will eliminate any price increases, and a short all the way up to 35% would essentially pass all of the efficiency gains in this simple example onto consumers, so that the merger would create sort of zero net gains for the merged parties, right? So any sort of short in between that should make both parties better off. The merger is profitable for JetBlue and Spirit, and also lowering prices for consumers. All right, so then we talk a little bit about how this might apply to some mergers that were at least somewhat recent at the time we first started writing it. How recent they still are, I guess, depends on your definitions. So there's the sugar merger between U.S. Sugar and Imperial Sugar. And we include this because we think this is kind of a case, actually, which is maybe not the best for this remedy, and this is going to illustrate some of the reasons why. Right? So the court ultimately rejected DOJ's challenge here, saying distributors should be included in the market. We questioned, would negative ownership potentially convince DOJ that distributor competition would have been sufficient, kind of along with negative ownership, right? The problem here is there was really only one other firm who was sort of a direct competitor, right, that was American Sugar, that we could take a short position in, right? You wouldn't want to take a short position in the distributors because they were, in addition to being, competitors in some sense, right, were also complements in some others, right? And so that would require like a very large short position, kind of all in one firm. Certainly would be hard to implement directly through shorts, and would be a pretty severe change to executive compensation. We think a better case is this insurance merger of Aon and Willis Towers Watson. And part of the reason we think this was a merger actually that was approved by the European Commission with relatively small divestitures. Right? But the DOJ wasn't quite satisfied with those. They wanted some more divestitures, and the parties ultimately abandoned the merger because they felt like those larger divestitures were undermining the efficiency rationale. Right? So the fact that we think that the EC approved it suggests that it was at least a relatively close call, right? And so you might think that a small additional short position, in addition to the divestitures required by the European Commission, might have been able to satisfy the DOJ instead of some additional divestitures. And here there's at least three other competitors, right? So you're not sort of having to take a very large short position in just one other rival. What I think we think the best case of the three is this book publishing merger of proposed Penguin Random House and Simon & Schuster. And here, these were the largest and fourth largest of the major trade book publishers. And the court blocks it, saying it's going to reduce prices for best-selling authors. So the concern here was in some sense, it's like a labor case in some ways, right? It's an input market where the concern was that best-selling authors were going to receive lower prices because there would be one less bidder for their books, right? So here we think negative ownership is potentially a good solution, right? So we'd still have 3 other large book publishers where you could take a negative ownership position, right? And if we had that negative ownership, right, it's easy to see how that's going to induce more aggressive bidding, right? If Penguin Random House, Simon & Schuster bids a little bit more for some proposed bestseller, right? Either they get it, denying the benefit of that to one of their rivals, or if they don't get it, they force one of their rivals to pay a little bit more, right? Either of which is going to be bad for the rival's profit. And so, right, we have those incentives to increase bidding, alleviating the big concern of the DOJ. All right, just briefly, we also think that, beyond mergers, it potentially could be applicable as a cartel remedy as well, right? We often see tacit collusion after the explicit breakup of a cartel, and we think negative ownership potentially could alleviate that as well. Now I think it's not quite as theoretically clear, right? Because although there is greater benefit with a negative ownership position of undercutting your rival and cheating on the cartel, it's also the case that the negative ownership position will lower competitive profits after the breakdown of the cartel and potentially then provide sort of less incentive to cheat because the continuation profits are lower. We think this is sort of illustrated by the Graphite electrode cartel in the 1990s, where the cartel increased prices substantially. 2 years after the discovery, prices were lower, but still 20% higher than above pre-cartel level. So there's a need for some additional remedy here. And we think negative ownership might be a remedy in addition to other cartel punishments that might eliminate that tacit collusion, right? And as we note in the paper, there's some empirical evidence suggesting that firms tend to reduce their use of relative performance evaluation in situations where they're trying to facilitate collusion, suggesting that negative ownership should help on this dimension. All right. Then in the last couple of minutes, I want to acknowledge some limitations, right? So first, just to say, we're not suggesting that this is a cure-all remedy that should be used in every merger, right? Rather, our approach is this is something that should be considered either by the agencies or we think maybe even more likely by firms as sort of a fix-it-first remedy to suggest, look, we're really trying to do this for efficiency purposes, and so we're willing to take this short position to alleviate any competitive concerns you might have, right? So some of the concerns we've heard, right, is the size of the position, right? Large short positions sometimes might be infeasible. They might be too costly. We think derivative contracts can certainly help alleviate any difficulty associated with borrowing shares, and relative performance evaluation approach might be easier in many cases as well. But usually, we're not really thinking about this as a remedy for, say, 3-2 mergers, but more when we're thinking about, 5-4 or 4-3 mergers, right? Another concern is heterogeneity on substitution, right? So, it's certainly possible, and we've worked this out in the appendix to our paper, that depending on the heterogeneity, you might actually have a long position in some firms and a short position in others. The net is going to be a short, but it wouldn't necessarily be a short on every firm, right? The estimation of that is going to be, not easy, but it's really not that different from what the agencies do now, particularly in cases when they're doing merger simulations, right? This is just like one extra parameter to stick into your merger simulation and shouldn't be that, that different, right? There's issues with multiple products and locations, and it's important to note that if competitive intensity is going to differ between different products, this remedy is not going to perfectly replicate pre-merger incentives. We can replicate them on the average, right? But it will be the case that because you can't short one division of a company, but only the company as a whole, right? That we're going to get higher prices on some products and lower prices on others. But potentially also combining this with divestitures could solve as well. Very quickly, since I see I'm running out of time, right? Sabotage is another concern, right? It might reward predatory and exclusionary conduct. We do see some evidence of this in the relative performance evaluation literature. This is obviously less of a concern in collusion cases. It's going to be a bigger issue in mergers, but it's also note that when we're dealing with merged firms that are relatively small, right, aren't likely to be the dominant firm, this is certainly less of an issue. And also, this is something where we suggest we can also have sort of a slightly more novel negative ownership of call options that could reduce the incentive to actually, reduce profits, but mostly just say you don't want to increase the profits of your rivals, right? So I have some conclusions, but it's basically what I've said, and since I'm already a little over time and I want to leave time for the discussant, I will stop here.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mehmet Ekmekçi. I'm a senior consultant at Campus Lexicon and professor of economics at Boston College. First, I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me the stage to discuss this very nice paper. I'd like to first give you a context in which I personally appreciate the insights of this paper, and then I'm going to make 2 points about the paper for discussion. So, common ownership corresponds to the situation where a firm, an entity, a person owns shares of several competing companies in an industry. Typically, common ownership leads to softened competition and leads to higher prices. This is because the profit function of one firm is going to internalize the profits of the competing firms, and hence the incentive to fight for market share will be diminished, leading to higher prices. Historically, an earlier example of common ownership occurred in the late 19th century in US railroad industry. JP Morgan at the time was holding large stakes of several US railroad companies and appointed directors at the boards of these companies and made arrangements, like informal arrangements for reorganizing the industry. Now, this led to a lot of cost-cutting synergies. For example, duplicate services were removed. The profits of these railroad companies were more stabilized, making the financial statements look healthier. On the other side, this also led to price increases. And this prompted investigations by the antitrust agencies. Eventually, this led to Clayton Act's provisions on interlocking directorates. More recently, in 2010s, in the last decade, major US airlines were owned by, or major shares of these airlines were held by large institutional investors like BlackRock and Vanguard. Although no explicit collusion was found, commentators were worried that the high airfares that we observed were a result of common ownership. Now, not all is that bad about common ownership. Actually, recent research suggests that in industries where there is overlapping R&D efforts, in industries where there are high fixed costs, or in industries where there are large network externalities or network effects, actually common ownership can lead to welfare gains, including consumer welfare gains. Now, the insight of this paper, the genius in the insight of this paper, is to use what seems to be a problem in one domain, common ownership, as a solution for another domain, namely horizontal mergers. So instead of when there's a merger going on, we can require the merged entity to short its rivals, and hence flipping the sign of ownership, common ownership, from being plus to being minus. Hence, this will in effect reverse the impact on competition from softening to strengthening the competition. I really like this idea. I think this is a very creative proposal as a behavioral remedy to horizontal mergers. Another typical structural remedy that is used in merger analysis is divestitures. But as Abe also discussed, divestitures are far from perfect. They sometimes fail. Sometimes it's difficult to define the correct sufficient buyer. For example, in the case of Albertsons, a supermarket chain, when Albertsons acquired United Supermarkets or Safeway later, Albertsons was required to sell several stores to comply with the approval of the merger. And later, as we go down the road through time, many of these stores were either closed or were repurchased by Albertsons. Similarly, Walgreens wanted to acquire Rite Aid, but then for several reasons related to difficulty of finding a sufficient divestiture buyer, they didn't go ahead with the merger. So this paper is proposing an alternative to divestiture as a behavioral remedy. This is somewhat similar to another behavioral remedy for platforms where we require platforms that are competing in an environment in the economy to employ interoperability. I believe that this could be a creative and flexible solution as a way to discipline potential anti-competitive behaviors down the road after the merger gets consummated. Now let me make my 2 points about the paper. The first one is about product design. Now in oligopoly markets, we still don't know quite much about how firms go around to find creative ways to soften competition. Consider 2 firms that are head-on competing in a market where they have similar products, say for simplicity, a homogeneous product. We wouldn't typically expect these firms to stay like that forever. Yeah, they're going to go out there and find ways of differentiating their products, maybe horizontally, maybe vertically, to try to find advertisement strategies that are going to target different audiences to, again, separate themselves. And this is not all that bad, because this is going to, investments in product design is going to lead to product variety. It's going to, and then advertisements will lead to more information to the consumers. Now, when we ask firms to short sell each other, then we are essentially lifting or diminishing their incentives to go out there and invest in product design. So that's my first point. The second point is about continuing with the limitations of the approach, as Abe mentioned. As I mentioned earlier, common ownership is not all that bad in certain industries, right? So if we are talking about an industry where there are overlapping R&D efforts, like drug companies that are focusing on drug discovery, for example, maybe requiring the companies to short sell each other's stock may not be a great idea. Similarly, in platform economics or in across platforms or digital markets, where there are a lot of network externalities, network effects, perhaps requiring the merged firms to short each other's stock may not be a great solution. However, in airlines or for drug companies that are producing generic drugs, perhaps this is a brilliant solution. One final limitation is in dynamic industries that are shaped by constant change, constant innovation, and disruption. The traditional merger assessment tools, and including the one that is proposed here, may overly focus on the current structure of the market instead of forwardly looking at how markets might evolve post-merger. Maybe there may be some limitations over there by not having a clear idea of how to require change in the amount of shares that we are going to require to short sell. There may be new entrants, et cetera, into that market. With that, I'd like to now leave the invite Abe to respond to any of the points or all of the points that I made.
Yeah, great. I don't know if this is on or not, but all right. Yeah, that's very helpful, and I just want to emphasize that we certainly aren't suggesting that this is appropriate for all or even most mergers. We think it's appropriate for enough mergers that it's worth considering. But no, I really do like the product design point, and that is definitely an additional wrinkle that needs to be thought about. In some settings, we might think that firms do too much product differentiation, and this merger might actually help along that dimension. But in other cases, and I think branded drugs are one where my limited understanding of the empirical evidence suggests that there may be already too great an incentive to try to kind of deal with minor improvements to existing therapies, and this would exacerbate that to the extent that it displaces the benefits to a rival rather than trying to come up with something new. And so that certainly is another very important consideration. Thanks a lot.